Hey everyone, hope you're having an amazing day. Today we're diving into a dramatic story where a powerful CEO is suddenly forced into a family-arranged marriage. But everything changes when he stands up at the dinner table and reveals that he already has someone he truly loves. What secret does he know about Trin? And how will his family react after his shocking rejection? Stay tuned because this story is full of tension, hidden truths, and emotional twists you won't want to miss. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next video. A formal atmosphere filled the private dining room of the luxury restaurant. Warm golden lights reflected softly against the crystal glasses on the table, while slow piano music played quietly in the background. Sitting across from each other were two middle-aged men who hadn't shared a long conversation like this in years. Mr. Quân slowly lifted his cup of tea and smiled at his old friend. "It's been a long time since we sat down together like this." Uncle Tung chuckled softly, his eyes filled with nostalgia. "You're right. Feels like just yesterday we were still young and struggling to build our careers, and now our children are all grown up." The two men laughed warmly, but beneath those smiles was a purpose that had already been carefully planned. This wasn't just a reunion between old friends. Tonight was about something much bigger. Mr. Quân placed his teacup down gently before speaking in a calmer, more serious tone. "The thing we talked about on the phone, I think we should officially discuss it today." Uncle Tung nodded immediately. "I was thinking the same thing. Honestly, I've always respected your family. If the two kids could become closer, I think that would be wonderful." For a brief moment, silence settled between them. Both men exchanged hopeful looks, silently understanding each other without needing to say much more. Their friendship had lasted for decades, and now they hoped that bond could continue through the next generation. Mr. Quân sighed lightly. "Quân is already 30 now. All he ever thinks about is work. Sometimes I worry he'll never make time for his personal life." He paused before continuing. "As parents, at the end of the day, we just want our children to settle down and have someone by their side." Uncle Tung smiled in agreement. "Trin is exactly the same. She spent years studying abroad and only recently came back home. She's talented, independent, but honestly, I'm afraid she's gotten too used to being alone." His eyes drifted toward the entrance as he spoke, the unmistakable concern of a father showing on his face. "I just hope she finds someone mature enough to take care of her." Mr. Quân smiled knowingly. "I think Quân and Trin would suit each other well." The two men exchanged another satisfied look. In their minds, this arrangement seemed almost perfect. The families were close. Their backgrounds matched. Both children were successful and well-educated. Everything seemed naturally aligned. A few moments later, the private room door slowly opened. A young woman stepped inside wearing an elegant cream-colored dress. Her long hair was tied neatly behind her shoulders, and her delicate makeup only highlighted her graceful appearance. Uncle Tung immediately smiled proudly. "Trin, come in." Trin politely bowed her head. "Hello, Uncle." Mr. Quân looked at her carefully before nodding in approval. "You're beautiful. You really resemble your mother when she was younger." Trin smiled modestly. "You're too kind." Uncle Tung couldn't hide the pride in his voice. She just completed her studies overseas. She only returned to Vietnam recently. Mr. Quân nodded repeatedly. "That's impressive. It's rare to see someone both beautiful and talented these days." Just then, the door opened again. Quân walked into the room. He wore a dark dress shirt with simple styling, but his calm and mature aura immediately stood out. Though there was visible exhaustion on his face from a long business trip, he still carried the composed presence of someone used to leading others. Mr. Quân immediately called out, "Quân, come sit down." Quân greeted everyone politely. "Hello, Uncle." Uncle Tung laughed warmly. "It's been years since I last saw you. I heard you're running the company now." Quân nodded slightly. "Just work responsibilities, Uncle." Mr. Quan looked at his son with visible pride. He's been obsessed with work since he was young, always at the office. Then he turned toward Trinh. This is Trinh, Uncle Tung's daughter. I think you two should get to know each other better. Trinh smiled first. I've heard a lot about you already. Quan gave a polite nod. It's nice to meet you. The dinner quickly became livelier as the two fathers reminisced about old memories together. They talked about the difficult years when they first started their businesses, the struggles they overcame side by side, and how they had supported each other through countless hardships. The longer they talked, the more natural this arrangement seemed to them. At one point, Uncle Tung looked directly at Quan and spoke with a meaningful smile. Your father and I have known each other since we were young, with nothing in our hands. If our families become relatives one day, that would truly make me happy. Mr. Quan immediately laughed in agreement. That's right. We're getting older now. All we want is to see our children living stable and happy lives. Their words sounded casual, but every sentence carried invisible pressure, and Quan could feel it clearly. He remained silent for a few seconds, eyes lowering toward the glass in front of him. At that moment, only one person appeared in his mind, Tieu Lac, the girl who had stayed beside him during his hardest days. The only person who could calm him down after endless meetings, business pressure, and exhausting work trips. He had planned to tell his family about her eventually. He just never expected things to move this fast. Across the table, Trinh maintained her elegant smile. She was beautiful, intelligent, and incredibly good at social interactions. To anyone looking from the outside, she would seem like the perfect daughter-in-law. But Quan knew things others didn't. Behind her graceful appearance were secrets hidden carefully beneath the surface. Through business connections, Quan had accidentally learned several things about Trinh during her years abroad. Complicated relationships, situations where she manipulated people to achieve her goals. Because of that, despite barely knowing her personally, Quan had always kept his distance. Meanwhile, dinner continued pleasantly around him. The two fathers occasionally tried to create opportunities for Quan and Trinh to talk. Quan, you should bring Trinh to visit your company sometime. She just came back to Vietnam. She probably doesn't know many people yet. Young people should spend more time together. Quan simply smiled politely. Maybe when work becomes less busy. His answers were respectful, careful enough not to embarrass anyone, but distant enough to avoid encouraging false hope. Trinh seemed to notice it too. She looked at him quietly for a second before asking softly, "Are you always this busy?" Quan nodded calmly. The company has several important projects right now. That sounds stressful. I'm used to it. The conversation ended there. Short, polite, cold. For just a split second, Trin's expression stiffened slightly before she quickly smiled again, as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, the two fathers remained completely immersed in their excitement for the future they imagined. Quan looked at his son and joked lightly, "You really should start thinking about marriage. At your age, I already had you." Uncle Tung laughed loudly. "That's true. Once a man becomes successful, he should settle down." Those words made Quan slowly tighten his hand beneath the table. He hated feeling pressured, especially when it came to love. A brief silence followed. Finally, Quan lifted his gaze and spoke calmly. "I think relationships should happen naturally." Mr. Quan's smile faded slightly. "What do you mean?" Quan remained composed. "I appreciate everyone's concern, but right now I want to focus on work." Uncle Tung quickly waved his hand with a light laugh to ease the tension. "There's no rush. The two of you can slowly get to know each other." Trinh nodded gently as well. "He's right, Uncle. We only just met." The atmosphere softened again, but inside Quan felt more conflicted than ever. He didn't want to disappoint his father. He also didn't want to embarrass Uncle Tung. But at the same time, he couldn't stay silent and let this misunderstanding continue growing. Dinner lasted for nearly another hour. When the final dish was served, Uncle Tung suddenly smiled and suggested, How about Quân takes Trinh out somewhere after this? Maybe coffee or a walk? Mr. Quân immediately agreed. That's a good idea. Young people should spend time alone. All eyes turned toward Quân. For a few seconds, he remained silent. Then he slowly stood up. I'm sorry, but I need to return to the company. The atmosphere instantly paused. Quân continued calmly. There's still a lot of unfinished work from my business trip. I also have an important meeting tomorrow morning. Mr. Quân looked at his son as if he wanted to say something, but eventually only sighed softly. If work is important, then go ahead. Uncle Tung smiled understandingly. Of course, work comes first. Trinh nodded politely. Maybe another time then. Quân looked at her briefly. I'm sorry I couldn't spend more time talking today. It's okay. He respectfully bowed his head toward the elders. Please excuse me. Then he turned and walked out of the room. The moment the door closed behind him, Quân finally released a long breath. A sense of relief immediately washed over him. But along with that relief came guilt. He knew how much his father had hoped for tonight. He also understood how sincerely the two older men wanted their families to become closer. Yet the more they pushed, the more trapped he felt. His footsteps echoed quietly through the empty hallway of the restaurant. After a few moments, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The moment the screen lit up with a familiar name, his expression softened instantly. Tieu Lac. Quân stared at the name for several seconds before finally pressing call. The phone rang briefly, then her voice came through. Hello? The moment he heard her voice, the tension inside him eased slightly. Quân leaned against the wall beside the hallway and spoke quietly. What are you doing? I just got home. Did you finish dinner? Quân stayed silent for a moment before giving a faint smile. Yeah, I just finished. Tieu Lac immediately sensed something strange in his voice. Are you tired? Quân rubbed his forehead slowly. My dad arranged a meeting for me tonight. There was silence on the other end. Then her soft voice returned carefully. You mean a blind date? Tieu Lac fell silent for several seconds after hearing those words. Even through the phone, Quân could still feel the slight shift in her breathing. A blind date? She repeated softly, almost unsure if she had heard him correctly. Quân closed his eyes briefly and leaned harder against the wall behind him. Yeah. The hallway around him remained quiet, but inside his mind, everything felt messy and exhausting. Tieu Lac tried to keep her voice calm. So, how did it go? Quân let out a short breath, almost like a bitter laugh. It wasn't really a date, more like both families already planned everything in advance. There was another brief silence. He could imagine her sitting quietly somewhere in her apartment, holding the phone tightly while trying not to overthink. Quân understood her too well. Before she could say anything else, he spoke first. I told them I wasn't interested. Her voice became quieter. You did? Yeah. Quân loosened his tie slightly before continuing. My dad and Uncle Tung want me and Trinh to get married eventually. They think it would strengthen the relationship between the two families. Tieu Lac lowered her gaze unconsciously. Even though she had expected something serious, hearing the words "get married" still made her chest tighten. And what about you? She finally asked. Quân answered without hesitation. I already have someone I love. The moment he said those words, the heaviness inside him suddenly eased. On the other end of the call, Tieu Lac slowly bit her lip, trying to hide the emotions rising in her heart. But Quân wasn't finished yet. I made it clear tonight that I don't agree with this arrangement. He paused for a moment. And honestly, I don't trust Trinh. That caught her attention immediately. What do you mean? Quân glanced down the empty hallway before lowering his voice. There are things about her that my dad doesn't know. He thought back to the information he had accidentally learned months ago through overseas business partners. At first, he hadn't cared much, but after tonight, every detail came back clearly in his mind. When Trinh was overseas, she got involved with some people in the investment world. A few scandals happened, but they were covered up pretty quickly. Tulak frowned slightly. Scandals? Quân nodded even though she couldn't see him. She's smart, very smart, but she knows how to use people to get what she wants. He spoke calmly, but there was obvious caution in his voice. I'm not saying she's a bad person, but she's definitely not someone I'd ever choose to build a future with. Tulak stayed quiet, listening carefully. For some reason, hearing Quân explain everything so honestly made her feel both relieved and worried at the same time. Relieved because he had rejected the arrangement. Worried because family pressure was never something simple, especially in families like his. After a moment, she asked softly, "Was your dad upset?" Quân smiled bitterly. He tried not to show it. He slowly straightened himself and began walking toward the parking area. But I know him. He already imagined this whole future in his head before tonight even started. The sound of his footsteps echoed faintly through the underground parking garage. Tulak could picture the exhausted expression on his face without even seeing him. "You shouldn't fight with your family because of me," she whispered. Quân stopped walking immediately. "What did you just say?" Her voice became smaller. "I mean, your dad clearly wants this. Maybe you should think carefully before..." Before she could finish, Quân interrupted firmly. "Tulak," it was the first time that night his tone became serious. "I called you because I wanted you to hear the truth from me directly." He unlocked his car door but didn't get inside yet. "I don't care how perfect this arrangement looks to everyone else. I'm not going to pretend to like someone when my heart already belongs to another person." Tulak lowered her eyes, her fingers tightening slightly around the phone. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Quan's voice softened again. "Do you really think I'd let someone else replace you that easily?" Her heartbeat quietly sped up. Back inside the private dining room, the atmosphere had completely changed after Quân left. Mr. Quân sat silently while slowly rotating the wine glass in his hand. Across from him, Uncle Tung forced a smile. "Kids these days are independent. We can't rush them too much." Mr. Quân sighed heavily. "I know my son. The more pressure I put on him, the more he'll resist." Trinh remained quiet beside her father, but unlike the calm expression on her face, her thoughts were far from peaceful. She replayed the entire dinner in her mind. Quan's distant attitude, his polite but cold responses, and especially the moment he rejected the idea of spending time alone with her. No man had ever treated her that way before. Back when she studied overseas, she was always the center of attention. Wealthy businessmen, successful investors, even celebrities had pursued her. Yet tonight, Quân barely looked interested. That irritated her more than she expected. Uncle Tung suddenly turned toward his daughter. "What do you think of Quân?" Trinh picked up her glass slowly before answering with a small smile. "He's different from what I expected." Mr. Quân looked at her carefully. "In a bad way?" She shook her head calmly. "No. Actually, that's what makes him interesting." At the same time, outside in the parking garage, Quân finally sat inside his car. The engine remained off. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes briefly. Tulak's voice came softly through the speaker. "You sound exhausted." Quân laughed quietly. "I am." "Then go home and rest." "I will." But instead of ending the call, he stayed silent for a moment longer. Then he suddenly spoke again. "There's something else." Tulak blinked slightly. "What is it?" Quân opened his eyes slowly. "My dad doesn't know about you yet." Her expression immediately stiffened. "Oh, I wanted to tell him after things at the company became more stable. But now," he exhaled slowly, "I think I waited too long." Tulak sat quietly on the edge of her bed. Deep down, she always knew this conversation would come eventually. The difference in their backgrounds had never been a secret. Quân came from a wealthy and influential family. Meanwhile, she had built her life quietly on her own without powerful connections or family status behind her. To people like Mr. Quân, she probably wouldn't look like the ideal match. Maybe your dad just wants what's best for you, she said carefully. Quân gave a faint smile. I know. Then don't be too hard on him. He stared through the windshield at the dim parking lights ahead. The problem is, I'm tired of everyone deciding my future for me. That sentence carried years of pressure hidden beneath it. Ever since taking over the company, every step of his life had been tied to expectations. How he should act, who he should meet, what kind of marriage would benefit the family. For the first time in years, Tiểu was the only thing in his life that felt truly real and personal, and he refused to let anyone take that away from him. Back inside the restaurant, Trinh excused herself and stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the city. The cool night breeze brushed against her hair as she crossed her arms thoughtfully. Her phone vibrated. One of her old friends from overseas had sent her a message. Back in Vietnam already? Found your next target yet? Trinh smirked faintly before typing a short reply. Maybe. She slipped the phone back into her purse and looked out at the glowing city lights below. At first, she had only agreed to tonight's dinner because of her father, but now, Quan's rejection had unexpectedly sparked her curiosity. A man like him wasn't easy to control, and people were always more attractive when they couldn't be easily obtained. Meanwhile, Quân finally started the engine and drove out of the parking garage. The city streets at night blurred past the windows as he continued talking to Tiểu through the car speakers. What are you thinking about? He asked. She hesitated briefly before answering honestly. I'm thinking things are probably going to get harder from now on. Quan's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. Maybe. And if your family keeps pressuring you, then I'll handle it. His answer came instantly. Tiểu sighed softly. You say that now, but family expectations aren't easy to fight against. Quân turned at the next intersection, his expression calm but determined. I know. Then why are you so sure? For a moment, only the sound of the road filled the silence between them. Then Quân finally answered. Because losing you would bother me more than disappointing anyone else. Tiểu froze completely. Her heart trembled quietly at his words. Quân rarely said emotional things directly, but whenever he did, every word carried weight. She lowered her gaze, unable to stop the small smile forming on her lips. Back at the restaurant, the dinner was finally ending. Mr. Quân stood up slowly and adjusted his jacket. I'm sorry if tonight felt uncomfortable. Uncle Tung immediately shook his head. Don't say that. They just need more time. Trinh also smiled politely. I understand. But deep inside, she had already made a decision. She wasn't someone who gave up easily, especially not after being rejected. As the three of them walked toward the exit, Mr. Quân suddenly stopped for a moment. For some reason, Quan's earlier words kept replaying in his mind. I already have someone I love. At the time, he had ignored it. But now thinking back carefully, his son's eyes had been completely serious. Mr. Quân slowly frowned. Could Quân really already be in a relationship? And if he was, who exactly was the girl capable of making his son reject a perfect arrangement like this? Meanwhile, several streets away, Quân finally arrived outside Tiểu apartment building. He parked the car by the sidewalk but didn't get out immediately. Are you home already? She asked softly. Yeah. Then go upstairs and sleep. Quân looked up toward the apartment windows glowing warmly above. After a brief silence, he suddenly asked, Do you want me to come see you? Tiểu blinked in surprise. At this hour? He paused briefly before smiling tiredly. I want to see you for a little while. Her heartbeat quickened again. Even after such an exhausting night, the first place he wanted to go was still her. That thought alone made all her anxiety fade slightly. After a few seconds, she whispered softly, Okay. Quân smiled faintly for the first time that night. Then he grabbed his coat and stepped out of the car. Neither of them realized that tonight's dinner had only been the beginning. The tension between family expectations, hidden secrets, and genuine love was about to grow far more complicated than any of them imagined. At a luxurious family dinner, CEO Quân is unexpectedly introduced to Trinh, the daughter of his father's longtime friend. Both families hope to turn their close friendship into a powerful marriage alliance, believing Quân and Trinh are the perfect match. While the two fathers excitedly discuss their future, Quân quietly struggles under the pressure. Unknown to everyone, he is already deeply in love with Tu Tieu and has no intention of accepting the arranged relationship. As the dinner continues, Quân becomes even more certain after remembering several dark secrets he knows about Trinh from her past overseas. Finally, he politely but firmly rejects the family's plans, leaving everyone shocked. After leaving the restaurant, Quân immediately calls Tu Tieu and honestly reveals everything, while hidden tensions, family expectations, and dangerous secrets begin to slowly surface behind the scenes.